Jesus is Jewish. First point of fact. We must begin here to understand Christianity, the Catholic Church, Catholicism. We must first know something a bit about Judaism. So this presentation is going to discuss ever so briefly an introduction to the Old Testament, also called the First Testament, and the uniqueness of the Jewish people within human history. So let us go now to a presentation talking about the Jewish people or Judaism. So we see here the first point, introduction to the First Testament. And the First Testament, also called the Old Testament, or the Hebrew Scriptures, is the written testament, the written testimony of a people's relationship with God. The Jewish Tanakh, as it's called, the Hebrew Scriptures, an entire legacy of faith. So to understand Jesus, who is Jewish, whose mother is Jewish, Joseph is Jewish, all the 12 apostles are Jewish, we must understand something about Judaism. The roots of Christianity is Judaism. Christianity itself can be understood as a reform movement within the religion, the religious tradition of Judaism. So we want to think about this people a bit together, the whole history of salvation for the Jewish people. So we see here the First Testament in relation to the Second Testament, or the Old Testament in relation to the New Testament, as Christianity talks about these two respective testaments of Scripture. In the Hebrew Scriptures, the Tanakh, it begins with oral tradition. Long before there are things committed to writing, these stories, these legal codes, these regulations of worship, long before they're committed to writing, they're first very present and alive in an oral tradition. Eventually, it will be redacted in written form, and the Hebrew Scriptures, for short, is called the Tanakh by the Jewish people, coming from the acronym TNK. T standing for Torah, the first 5 books of Scripture, also called the Pentateuch, or the Law of Moses. The Nevi'im, the prophetic writings like Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Habakkuk, Joel, Nahum, etc. And the Ketuvim, the writings, the historical writings of the people of Israel. Books like 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, and the rest. So these are the books that make up the Hebrew Scriptures, written primarily in Hebrew, some Aramaic, like in the book of Daniel, for example. But here you see on the page, this is the Hebrew text here, and this is what Hebrew looks like, and is read from right to left. So the whole First Testament comes before the Second Testament or the New Testament for Christian faith. Here is an image of Talmud, Jewish Talmud. So it's important to understand in the Judeo-Christian tradition, when approaching a sacred text, we must approach the text as a text within a text within a text. We must always read the biblical text, the sacred text, within a greater context of meaning and tradition of interpretation. So we can't just take an English translation of Scripture and just run with it and with our best interpretation. We have to situate it very carefully, oftentimes with the help of scholarly footnotes, and with an eye to the whole tradition of rabbinic interpretation of the Hebrew Scriptures. So this is the image of Talmud, where you see in the middle of the page the primary text surrounded by the text of rabbis' interpretations of the text. So any kind of piece of Scripture must be contextualized. This is very important as we go about studying theology. So who is the Jewish people, also called the people of Israel or the Hebrew people? Something that sets them apart in the ancient world is their ethical monotheism. They're a people who believes that there is only one God, creator of the heavens and the earth. They're different than many other tribes and people groups in the ancient world who worship a variety and plurality of deities, gods and goddesses, like the god of the mountain, the god of the sun, the god of the ocean, the god of fertility, the god of the harvest, etc. But the Jewish people understand themselves to be in covenant relationship with the one true God, the creator of the heavens and the earth. And this God has a name. And the name goes back to the book of Exodus chapter 3 and this revelation of this one true God to Moses in the phenomenon of a bush that is on fire but not consumed. So this Hebrew text here is the sacred name of God. And for the Jewish people, it's such a sacred name, you don't even say it. We transliterate these Hebrew consonants with the English here, based on the Hebrew letters Yod, Het, Vav, Het. And this is so sacred, I don't even say this word out loud, even as a Catholic, because out of respect of the Jewish people, the Jewish tradition, and I think it's wonderful to continue, even within Christianity, the name that is not spoken out loud, but signifies the one true God at once hidden, yet revealed, incomprehensible, yet given over to comprehension to some degree through this self-revelation of God. So the last point of this short presentation is the defining event in the history of the people of Israel called the Exodus. And this, as you recall, is related in the book of Exodus in Scripture when the Hebrew people are living as slaves in Egypt. And we won't go into the whole backstory now, but they're living as slaves in Egypt. And God calls and raises up a liberator of the Hebrew people named Moses to go and confront Pharaoh, the ruler of Egypt, and to tell him to let the Hebrew people go. Let them free. Let them be free. And so there's a series of plagues culminating in the death of the firstborn children of the Egyptian families. And the Hebrew people is released and has this crossing of the Red Sea and this long journey, at least symbolically speaking, 40 years in the desert, making their way to the Promised Land, which will become the territory of Israel. So this event of liberation defines the Jewish people, and it is very essential for their self-understanding, and will become a real foundation for understanding what's happening in God's revelation in Jesus. So we conclude this part of the video for now, and we'll resume in a little while.